Welcome back, everybody. It is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, accompanied as always by my good friend Brendan Bond,
Hey, everybody.
and of course a regular, a friend of ours, Brian, whom we've talked to quite a bit before. Evening, Brian.
Good evening.
And we've got something different here for tonight. I'm very excited about this. But before we dive into it and I hand things over to Brian, I do want to thank Robert, who appeared with us last episode. We had a really interesting discussion. I know Brendan and I really enjoyed our time with Robert, and I still have a list of books. I've picked one of them up so far, and we've just heard a lot of really good feedback. A lot of people found Robert's conversation really interesting. And so if he's listening, and I'm sure he will eventually, just want to thank you again, Robert. And hopefully we will have him back on in the near future, especially as more questions come into us. But just kind of a new idea, something new for today is, there's a lot of great documentaries out there. And really, we live in a phenomenal time, not only for the production of documentaries, just because the cost of making really compelling things has gone down, but also the ability to access entire generations worth of media, again, never been easier. And there was recently a documentary that kind of came to my attention, and I was kind of tossing an idea around, and I thought I'd be really interested to see how Brian would respond to this, because again, very analytical and with a real interest in ghost hunting and everything. I kind of wanted to see where he would take this. So I stopped watching it. I said, I'm going to step away. And we kind of gave Brian an assignment if he was interested, and he ran with it. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian to kind of tell us, what is this documentary, his impressions, and, well, Brian, tell us about this.
Thanks, Nick. The documentary is named The House in Between, which is a 2020 documentary on a modern house that was built in the 1990s by its current owner, Alice. That was the name they gave her. The setting is in a small rural town of Florence, Mississippi, which is just south of Jackson, Mississippi. The backdrop is very conservative Bible Belt type town, very small. Everybody knows each other, where the population is very traditional, very conservative. The owner, Alice, who was probably of retirement age, had stopped living in the home after several years of experiencing odd and quite frightening experiences where objects would make noises or move, lights would flicker, and she would experience strange and unexplainable happenings. The town is presented by the producers as really a closed thinking type town in terms of the paranormal, where they're not really embracing a lot of that, probably because they are very conservative and it's a very religious type area. The town is very isolated from other places, and so is Alice. There's a tendency to not talk about things related to the paranormal in the area. They didn't really present her as being a part of a larger family. They didn't get into much about her demographics or personal history. The opening sequences of the film documentary present presumed, and I'll emphasize that, presumed evidence that something is going on in the home based upon her own reporting, that of others. And the initial investigators, who I've never heard of them before, but they sound like they're local or regionally based investigators, spend a significant amount of time trying to discover the phenomenon or gain evidence. Their efforts appear to reach plateau, and this is about 10 to 15 minutes into the documentary, where they just simply can't determine what is creating the activity, sounds, movement of objects, lighting anomalies, things of that nature. So the producer of this documentary is Steve Gonsalves. That's Gonsalves of Ghost Hunters fame. The show is currently active. Ghost Hunters show is currently active on Travel Channel, and he's a foundational member of the TAPS group. They bring him in and he's actually the producer of the whole program. And he's brought in to provide more out of the box ideas that can just go beyond just trying to find activity to really help the owner figure out what is going on. So with that being said, he begins to analyze different parts of the building, the property. He starts gaining some initial impressions of the property. But as you watch this investigation, it's unlike any that I've seen before. They really don't go into any kind of historical research. Maybe that is a error in the way that the video is produced. Perhaps they did go into history before. I'm sure they did their due diligence as a production company before they started this, but it's not presented in that manner. Rather, it's very much lacking in sophistication relative to any paranormal research investigations I've seen on TV or even read about. The focus of the two investigators that were originally there was focused on running around the entire house, locating activity, and it was very aimless and disorganized. They kept saying, "Oh, there's a noise. Oh, I think I hear something on the voice machine." There was just no historical research, which I think anybody that's going into these types of investigations seriously should consider. It just, to me, would appear to be a very critical aspect in determining any kind of targets that you would want to look at and strategies relative to investigating this home. They certainly presented in the title sequence and the introduction a lot of presumed kinds of evidence. And I say presumed because I'm very skeptical, obviously, if the listener can't already pick that out. My immediate view, clearly within the first 10 minutes, was that they were only focusing on aimlessly, I call it aimlessly, finding phenomena or looking at incidences that would prove, yes, indeed, there's activity here. The focus was more on locating activity. The efforts of the initial investigators was just simply going from room to room. There wasn't any information in the documentary about who they had talked to beforehand. I was also very skeptical that they were doing this. The owner was there. Typically, a lot of the researchers will have the owner leave and they have the place to themselves. They were missing just a lot of, I think, important investigation, I'll call them targets, to look at, namely the land that the house was built on. There was no initial information. I had a sense that there was something, having watched many of these documentaries over the years, typically there is land connected. There's some kind of events connected with the land. This is in Mississippi, so I would almost assume that there was Civil War or Native American wars or disturbances on the property. There could have been other homes built that, or even tragedies, catastrophic events, floods, death, fires. Oftentimes those things form kind of like a perfect storm, so to speak. I was also, questioning whether there was just something attached residually from some of these events. That wasn't really borne out. It wasn't until towards the middle of the documentary, Steve, the investigator brought in, started questioning the topography and the geology and the aspects of the land. I was questioning too. My mind was running towards, are there magnetic lines? Are there magnetic fields, things that could create disturbance? Is there water underneath this land that could be fueling some things? Also, the stone tape theory, which is one of my favorite theories relative to paranormal activity. Was there something that made up this house? This house was built in 1990. However, did the wood come from someplace that had something connected to it? It seems a little wild and far out. But the investigators didn't really look at any of those things. None of this was discussed in the production until much later. One of the things we've talked about on this podcast that I've talked about specifically is the role of trauma. tragedy, loss, and the psychic energy that can sometimes be carried along with people. This is not something that's make believe. This is real. Somebody can bring that with them into a house, because I could not figure out quite how could a fairly new house, she's the only owner, nobody's ever lived there, how could there be all this stuff that's actually going on? And there was really no reference to her own personal history. And I really suspected and would have wanted to investigate further. Did she have any critical events or traumas or losses that could have carried with her into that particular place? Oftentimes, there can be phenomenon where movement of objects are really poltergeist activity. So, there's one camp that says poltergeists are more demonic or have a negative energy type situation. I tend to subscribe to the opposite, that it can be trauma based. It can be there can be psychic negativity with the person that could be unresolved and not dealt with. We call it telekinetic phenomenon or quality. It's believed that a person who's telekinetic can move objects, cause activity in a home or an area because there's a chronic or ongoing trauma, an unresolved one. And basically the person carries the stress with them. So that wasn't really addressed at all, even investigated. And I have seen some other investigations where that is critically looked at with people, especially if there's a lot of movement. Now, finally, I think just to kind of finish the overview here, I think that there was a significant finding about the land when they brought in a psychic medium who was the only investigator who used any kind of objectivity. That doesn't make sense regarding maybe psychic medium, but I think in this case it did, because these other investigators were using no controls. They were just running from one thing to the next. This person actually did not know anything about this place, didn't even know where she was going unless she followed Google Maps, and then arrived and met the people for the first time. And she discovered that there had been a previous house on that property that had, I believe, burned down in a fire. And then there was subsequent, as the investigation unfolds, there's this kind of passing conversation about how the town had experienced a tragic fire. There wasn't much to it. And then as we go on, there's more about a cemetery that was moved, and they don't know if that really, as they developed the property, whether that was actually, where those graves went or where they were or anything. And there was even a hint of the owner of the previous house that had been on that property was a very cruel individual who did bad things I wasn't sure if he was a slave owner or something that nature. There was really no details. So, when we look at the investigation itself, Steve is the one that brings in all of these things. He touched on different types of things. The land, met a clerk who said there was a cemetery close by, did touch on this medium. He did talk about how there was a previous house, but there was never any depth to any of it. And they spent a lot of time going on in tangents. He talked to some renowned physicists, academic physicists, who offered some scientific explanations for motion and light and multidimensional. I don't like that word dimensional. They didn't either, but multidimensional or phenomenon where there's different dimensions and things can pass between and so forth. It was just an interesting talk. There was also some poorly constructed physics experiments that were tried in a home but did not lead to any conclusions. And it was so, I think, very weak in the sense that they were trying to get this ball, and they were trying different things from their talks with the physicists on what could move a ball. I've never seen that before. Usually if a ball's going to move, it's going to move. And I didn't see where that went. The part that really disturbed me the most about their inquiry was going off into a tangent about UFOs. And I'm thinking, what does UFOs have to do with this? You have a medium who says, yeah, there was a house here before and it burned. And there was a cruel owner. I'm thinking that's tangible historical information. Let's follow that. But instead, the documentary would go into the wild tangents about aliens and alien activity causing the light activity in the home that the owner was experiencing. I have never heard that before. That is and I'm very fully aware of Kecksburg, and I find that very interesting, and Roswell and some of these other places. But that just seemed bizarre why that was even considered in this review. And there was some really interesting things: moved cemetery, a house that burned, a cruel owner who lived in the house, presumably. And then they brought in bloodhounds. That was the next thing that they tried, which I've seen that is kind of one of the standard practices that ghost hunters uses. They have used that before in old farmhouses and country locations. I have seen that being used more and more in investigations, which may have some merit. However, the bloodhounds would never really. It was so interesting because I've never heard this before either, where the bloodhound owner said that the bloodhound can smell decay matter through leaves and trunks of a tree. And I'm like, wow, that's really new. I could understand if it's ground, dirt, those kinds of things. That just seemed a little bit questionable to me.
It's highly
because
questionable.
We would presumably smell that in cemeteries probably too. And I'm not trying to be facetious, but that just seemed very bizarre. So there was a lot of these tangents and everything, trying to figure out what was going on. And they even said, well, there was somebody was killed in the backyard. The medium, I think, had suggested somebody was killed in the backyard. And okay, that's an interesting, good historical research that we can follow through by looking at records and coroner's records and court records and things of that, newspapers and things like that. That was never done. So it was almost like this investigation was really aimless, and they had really good things that they could have pursued, but didn't. And they were looking for a quick fix. One of the things that me being kind of a student of psychology, practicing clinical things, there's a concept called expectancy theory. And one of those things that we look at with expectancy theory, which I think really explains what went on here, was it proposes that an individual will behave or act in a certain way because they are motivated to select a specific behavior over others due to what they expect the result to be. So it's a motivational thing, and it comes out of management theory, which was developed by a person by the name of Victor Vroom, Vroom. He's a Yale professor of management. He's long retired. I think he's still living. Who anyone that studies management, this is one of those theories that you read. And I thought, wow, that really kind of speaks to what was going on here, because there's so many weaknesses, so much tangential kinds of actions and behaviors trying to find things. So, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, however, wasn't really convinced that they were finding anything. Was it just what they were expecting, or, they were making choices on avenues of inquiry based on what they expect they would find? So I want to bring both of you into this discussion and given the fact that we can actually see each other, I know our listeners can't see us see each other, but we do see each other. And I know there was some very strong reactions when I mentioned some of the evidence that they found. I have to start out with Brendan because I feel like he's on the edge of his seat.
I'm over here yelling into a muted mic, Now, full disclosure, it does seem like there is a part 2 that is out there that came out in 2022. Have not watched that yet, so maybe some of the things that we're going to talk about have been resolved. So,
well, and maybe that's a follow-up where you're gonna watch that one.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, just some of the just quick thoughts on what you were mentioning, Brian. It's like they were so close to realizing that hauntings have nothing to do with dead people, but they just couldn't see it. This all has to do with, at least in this instance, I think that if you were looking for a documentary to prove that dead people have nothing to do with hauntings, go watch them try and prove that dead people have something to do with hauntings. Whenever they brought in Steve, and again, I'm assuming that everybody in this documentary is, truthful and has the best intentions. Just want to say that right off the bat too, because whenever they bring Steve in, again, by all accounts, seems like a really nice guy, and seems genuine. Some of the avenues he goes down, like you mentioned, Brian, it seems like he's trying to pick apart what's going on because these people are getting a little bit of everything. It's not like there's a clear direction. It's just like a smattering of general consistent paranormal activity. So I get you do have to kind of at that point cast a wide net so you can narrow it down in the future. But every time they tried to narrow it down, it was fruitless. Like when you talk to the physicist about, stone tape theory, or when they talked about magnetism and the one ball moving. I did like that Steve did say out loud, do I think aliens were visiting her in her bedroom? No. He was very, he did come out and was just I don't think that's what's happening here. But I think you're just one step away from realizing that this phenomenon that is happening has nothing to do with those external sources that we normally talk about. I think some of that has to do probably just with how production works. They obviously were doing this for a long time, gathering information, and you got to cut some stuff out. But that being said, you're right, Brian, that whenever they showed these folks initially investigating, they're you're not being facetious by saying they're literally just running room to room, with stuff like REM pods going off and them saying they're hearing stuff and everything, which is probably legitimate phenomena, but they're not, they're just reacting to it. They're not trying, they say they're trying to study it, but by studying it, they're just doing the same thing over and over again. I think that's kind of why they brought in Steve in the first place. Then whenever they do kind of get to, like you mentioned, going to the town history and realizing there's some trauma to this land, probably the first thing they do is try and go and find a body to legitimize that part of the story. And it's at this point, you have the neighbor who says nothing happens at her house coming over and having a psychic attack in the woods, and the big oh, there must be a dead body here. And it's well, who cares if there's a dead body at this point that's 150 years old? Everybody here thinks that there is one. So what does it matter? What's the difference? What is finding that body that may or may not exist going to prove to you guys? It's almost a fruitless venture at that point.
Well,
even if
what do you do when you find it?
Right.
If you find it, how do we have to consecrate this body? Do we have to move it?
Right. Even whenever Steve was doing some of the, I was laughing whenever you were talking about the debunking experiments, Brian, because again, using canned air to spray a baseball into falling down the stairs to prove it took a lot of air to move the baseball. And then him banging, trying to find a spot where it's if I bang on the stairs from the underside, that'll then make the ball move. It's well, okay, but there was no one there banging on the stairs to make the ball move. So why is that a possible explanation? You know?
May I pose a question
Yeah.
though? Is that did
Yeah.
they look towards travel on the roads or trains or any drafts? I mean, it would have to be a
Right.
significant draft, of course, because canned
Yeah.
air comes out pretty. But I
Right.
mean, did they look to any vibrations
Well,
on that?
one of my favorite parts was, and again, this takes place, like I said, Brian, I believe in Mississippi. They bring in a contractor at one point to like test the leveling of the house to make sure the house isn't like settled weird. And the guy's like, no, it's, as level as it was, when it was built or checked in 94 or something like that, he said. And then they had an electrician come in and check the lights because they have this chandelier that keeps like blinking and swinging and everything. And he's like, nah, he's like, I'd love to see it because it seems fine, kind of thing. And it's all in this like Southern drawl. And I'm just like, if this guy says the electricity's fine, I believe him. This guy doesn't seem like he messes around. But so they did test all the normal stuff, but like Brian was kind of getting at, I think, with the what was the word you used for like
The expectancy theory.
expectancy theory? Yes, thank you. If you have someone sitting there, asking these questions and assuming it's a dead person that they're trying to communicate with, and then you have activity that apparently is supposed to confirm that you're having contact. I guess it's just one of those things where part of me is like, what's the end goal here? Like, there's obviously activity like, again, assuming this is all above board, there's obviously activity going on, but like, whenever she talks about like the aliens and they're like, oh, this lady saw something 20 miles away. And it's like, not say who cares, but it's just like, you guys are really missing the forest for the trees here, like in a really major way. And it reminds me of some of the early John Keel stuff where he's looking for like very concrete one-to-one explanations for things. And it's like, dude, you got to take a step back and look at what's going on here. And when you do that, like you said, Brian, you're like, maybe there's some trauma going on here. Like maybe the fact that you have this, like the one investigator who said he was a podcaster, and we all know how podcasters are, was like showing them like where his house was, and he's podcast next to a window that's covered in like cobwebs and stuff. Like it just, there was enough little red flags that make me wonder if everybody doing all this investigation, like you said, Brian, maybe we're bringing things in.
Real quick, Nick, one of the things that I was spending a lot of time watching and looking at was people. That's what I do for a living. So I was watching the nonverbals, the verbals of the owner, and she looked very distressed at the very least. So I don't really doubt that there was some emotional issues that she was carrying with her in this. She does not live in the home, has not lived in the home for quite a while, is legitimately fearful to be in that home by herself. I got a sense that she probably lives alone. There may not be other people in her family, or she doesn't have a family. That is very relevant to me. She seemed extremely distressed through the whole thing. She acted very vulnerable. This seemed very real to me. I didn't get a sense that she was creating any kind of hysterics around things. The people that were hysterical were the people investigating the home. They were the ones who were bringing drama into it. There was just this elevated emotionality around the home and anything in it, including the next door neighbor, who presumably had tea parties with the ghosts that lived, or the person that was
right
there, which we still don't know who were.
And they act like that was nothing. Continue.
So yeah.
Sorry.
So Nick, what's your? We need to get over to you.
Well, I have a few thoughts, and a lot of it's based on some of the things the two of you have just said. But I kind of wanted to dig on a couple things. It seems like there's really three things going on. There's the fact that most paranormal investigative teams and individuals are amateur, just because there's no real clear path to professionalism. There's no system of merit. There's no authoritative agency or whatnot. So just by the nature of it, So I thought bringing Steve Gonzalez coming in was going to bring that tighter a little bit, just because of the
A
fact
little bit of
that,
legitimacy. Yeah.
well, and in an area and in a field that it's not. Again, how do you make it legitimate? But
Good
the
point.
fact of
Yeah.
the matter, he's got more than 20 years of very public experience and being very visible. And the ghost hunter things, if anything else, it is very procedural, right? They have a way of doing it. So there's this confluence of this amateurism, which that's just the nature of this. There's very clearly trauma, which I'm super happy you highlight, Brian, because again, if we know nothing else, we know that she has abandoned this house that she built. There's so much behind that. That's just not you got scared out. There's definitely a thing there. And then of course the third item is that there are so many different breadcrumbs that are not picked up and followed through. I mean, the most frustrating one for you, it sounded like, was they keep hinting at possible different historical avenues that could be explored and confirmed, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of legwork to that. Maybe this second part goes deeper into that, but I've often said that ghost people are history people. By and large, it tends to be people that have just an innate appreciation and fascination with history. So why not follow through with deeper research into these historical avenues? Again, that can be very tangible, very concrete things, especially when you're not restricted to confines of a television show. Like, you've got the ability to really dive deeper into these things. So yeah, I have to give credit to the medium, which I'm not the first person to do. I am like way down the list on that. But I do want to say, with regard to mediums, though, one of the things I struggle with is I think mediums should be brought in completely cold, because one, they have to demonstrate a reason to have some confidence in them. So when you pair prior historical research and then you bring a medium in, I am fishy, because I think anything that's come up, they're going to focus on that. It's that kind of warm reading sort of thing. One thing I do want to bring up, well, two things. As a former resident of the great state of Mississippi, I will say I don't think a lot of people, and I mean this sincerely, and I'm not putting down the people of Mississippi, because obviously, got some connections there, and Grenada and Bolton, which isn't that far from Florence. Florence is a big town by Mississippi standards. I mean, it's blown up just in the time since I haven't been in the Jackson area, but there's a trauma in Mississippi. I don't think a lot of people outside or spent some real time really understand. Like, there are a lot of historical things that are there. It's also one of the poorest states. It may be the poorest. There's a trauma, and I don't think a lot of people can appreciate that until you spent time there. Small town Mississippi, if I know firsthand, it's a very lonely place. There's that great album title. I know Brendan, The Crowded Lonesome West, where there's all these people with no connections. Mississippi is neither crowded, but it is very lonesome. And to hear them emphasize that people don't buy into ghosts here, I have a hard time imagining that,
Right. No, I think you're onto something there, Nick. If you take a step back from this, the story about these people is probably so much more interesting than a baseball rolling down some stairs.
Yeah.
Like there's so much more humanity probably going on here, and there's so much more that could be fixed, healed, addressed if people would just take that step back. Is that kind of what you were thinking too, Brian, as far as like the swing and the miss of this documentary?
Yeah, I immediately, I'm a student of Civil War history. Also, I mean, if I wasn't doing psychology, I'd probably be doing history and teaching U.S. history in a university. But my life didn't go that direction. But I do enjoy reviewing that history of the Civil War. And what we do know is that, Vicksburg was a significant Mississippi town that was a significant part of the Civil War, and Grant's ability to overcome in that area. There were several vicious battles in the Vicksburg and Mississippi area. And that cannot be overstated at all. There was very, very, almost as bloody a battle as Gettysburg was. And there's really, I think, anybody worth their salt doing paranormal research, if you want to call it research or investigations, has to look at the context that people live in these areas. I think Nick also brings up, and I appreciate you bringing this up, Nick, because I haven't really known too many people from Mississippi. We had a family friend who was originally from Mississippi, but she lived where I grew up in Mercer County. And you could tell that her personality was such that she was very much into connecting with people because she didn't really like being alone. She liked to come up and visit the neighbors and so forth. So that, I don't know if you want to call it poverty. I'm not sure I would call it poverty, but that cultural backdrop has to play a part. I was initially struck, and again, I look at this stuff not so much from, okay, how many ghost sounds did they get? I wasn't really, and I'm sorry to the listener, I wasn't really interested in that. I was interested more in the methods and the experiences of the people. And I was just really honed in on this owner by the name of Alice. She just struck me as a very sad figure. And that has to play a part in what's going on for her. And that's why I really suggested that there could be these telekinetic lines of inquiry that should be made. And, there wasn't any of that demonic stuff brought up. There was nothing related to any of that brought up. But I do think that you really have to, there's an old saying that says the person's tied to the land. We really are tied to the land to some degree. It's kind of a saying that I've picked up over the years. And I think, that's really the line of inquiry that they should have followed.
I just wanted to say a couple quick things, and I think one will kind of get us into a little bit more of a focus here. But I mean, we're talking about the Civil War. Obviously, that overshadows a lot of things. Castle Long Shadow. We're talking about the Yazoo people, the Choctaw people. A lot of the towns that I knew in Mississippi weren't developed until kind of the mid 19th century, after the Choctaw people were forced out, which I believe occurred in like the late 1830s, 1840s. But we also have to talk about being tied to the land. The great floods of Mississippi, probably few more so than the great 1927 flood, which I don't think many people today understand just what a massive event the 1927 floods on the Mississippi and Yazoo River, all just so much of America was impacted by that. And those things continue on today. I mean, just hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding. One of the things in this that I did catch, that I thought, with so much being said about the town fire, about the possibility of a previous house having burnt down around the property, was the fact that they were having some interaction at one point with the smoke detector. And I don't feel as though they tied those two things together. So I feel like this is another frustration where there does seem to be things happening, but again, concrete avenues of potential exploration are not there. So again, that goes back to maybe some of this amateurism coupled with the trauma there.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right, Nick. And it's that kind of like tunnel vision perspective that people can have, having these expectations. And, like this gets into what we've talked before about, manifestation and the co-creative element of the paranormal. it really brings in a lot of those things. Whenever you have these problems or this activity, and people get so, because I'm as guilty as anyone else getting caught up in the mechanism of how these things work. I think the mechanism is worth, from a scientific standpoint, worth looking at. That's why you do need to talk to experts like physicists and geologists and people like that. But on the other side, you have to talk to psychologists and sociologists and historians. Show me a ghost hunting group that has equal parts of both of those, and I'd be very interested, to see what kind of conclusions they come to. And I think that's the missed opportunity in some of these things, because it's like they're so close. I'm not saying I have the answers by any stretch, but just in an hour-long documentary over something that obviously has activity, like you said, Nick, like there's obviously things happening, here. But if they would just take one step back and kind of remove some of their own confirmation bias to some of these things, they could not only start figuring out what's causing some of this stuff, but start trying to heal some of it, I think, too.
And I kind of want to throw this out. This might seem like a peace offering, but I mean this sincerely, because we've been pretty critical of the folks. But it seems like people with shared interests and exploring that shared interest, there's a camaraderie and there's an excitement. And when you're getting caught up in, like, we see all these things happening, the excitement can kind of carry you to running from room to room finding things, and the excitement can even kind of blind you to some of these things, some of the, like, looking deeper at the people and what they're going through, or where are they at, what level are they at right now. So I think that's another part of it. So, but I'm kind of curious, Brian, to, like, what were some things that you liked about the documentary as well?
Well, I think the fact that they were willing to bring the one physics professor, and I can't remember what his name was. I've seen him in other documentaries, Bigfoot, particularly Bigfoot, Expedition Bigfoot. They brought him in there. He's the one that's talked about cloaking and the bending of light and so forth. I should have wrote his name down here. He was very interesting. These both of those physicists were very, very smart. They were very matter of fact. They gave very good information. I also like the medium, and you mentioned about bringing that medium in cold. They reported it that way in this documentary, that she looked like, I have no clue what I'm getting into. And she seemed extremely blind. This is why we do double blind studies and research methods. You want to make sure that the person has no connection, no prior information. She had never met this Alice before, and I have no reason to believe that there was any kind of setup here or anything. I think Steve and the Ghost Hunters people are pretty, as you said, very procedural. They're very smart on how they go about things. They're not people that just try to bring in things. And even Steve admitted, I'm not really into doing this, but I think I'm going to do it just to, see if I can get something. And I was very impressed that she was very serious about her craft, and if you want to call it a craft. And she did not go into this with emotionality. Sometimes you'll see mediums who are very emotional, they get very hysterical, and it's very distracting to finding tangible things. But she found, she says, oh, let me look at this land out here. And she walked around and she says, there's something going on here with the land. And was there a house here before? And it was very interesting how she did that. Obviously, I like Ghost Hunters. I like that show. I like Steve. His personality is good. But that was about all that I really liked about the whole thing. But it did teach me a lot about how our psychology is wrapped up into trying to find, we have expectations on what we want to find, and we're going to do what we need to do to find it. I also don't doubt that this owner is in some significant chronic distress.
I want to echo some of the stuff you said right there, because I really do agree with it. I think that the medium, she was fantastic. I thought everyone seemed to be above board. the fact that she came in and picked up on some of the stuff that she did, that's, I mean, it's pretty impressive. Again, it's pretty impressive that they can come up with some of those things. And I think that it did add another layer of, again, like, it's like there's a story here, and people are, I just wish they would have gone a little deeper into some of the stuff. I wish they would have brought her back or let her stay there more, kind of thing, and see what would happen, because she was obviously plugging into something. I liked how it was shot. It was shot very much like a lot of ghost hunter stuff is, which you give me a voiceover of someone talking about a haunting with a semi out of focus shot of a side view mirror driving through rural America. I'm in. I'm I love that kind of stuff. So it was actually shot very well. With some of the editing, they did a lot of those long still security camera shots a la Paranormal Activity movies, which is just like creepy. Like, it's just good. Like, it's just good cinema. That was obviously a conscious choice.
Your AV side is clearly coming out in a
it
deep
is
way.
It is, but it's worth watching for some of those elements. Like, if you're into those things, watch it. It looks good. It is well shot. And again, there were times where I was yelling at my computer, watching this thing because of some of the stuff we've talked about, but I'd watch it again, and I want to watch the second one. There were things to like about it. And, again, I think the people, despite how we've talked about, there are obviously issues folks are having, I think they came across as truthful, likable, and like, I hope they get their stuff figured out. They seem like good people.
I'm definitely going to walk away from this conversation and looking at different haunting events and interviews and start to really kind of try to look for those things, like what else could be going on. We talk so much, almost annoyingly so, I can imagine, about, you prime yourself. Brian, I know you've heard us talk about, like, the classic thing we go to is, of course that building's haunted. Look, it's an old Victorian, it needs a coat of paint. Of course it's haunted. And we psych ourselves out. And I think that putting yourself in that mindset, you just ramp yourself up. It's so difficult to kind of come back down to a calm place. I've been very open that I don't have a lot of confidence in a lot of things, but the old Edgar Allan Poe quote, I don't believe in ghosts, but I lived in fear of them all my life. Like, that is very much me. And the more, like, sometimes I've gotten so mature that I will sometimes realize what hour of night it is, and I will stop watching this scary thing because I know I'm getting myself worked up. This is best watched when it's still light out. And I know where I'm at, what I believe. I still really, like, you can psych yourself out. Brian, go right ahead.
Yeah, certainly, for our listeners, it's never a good idea to watch Bigfoot investigations when you have a house by the woods and it's dark, right? It's the same concept, and I think I agree. I think everybody in this video or this documentary was genuine. I don't feel like anybody was trying to do anything that was inappropriate. I think they were trying to create some kind of a foundation or database. We'll have to wait and see, look at the next installment. There were just poor control methods that I saw in this whole documentary, and maybe it is due to just the way that the production rolled out onto this, and maybe they made some production mistakes. They should have had Steve come in a little earlier, maybe, and then put the other people's stuff a little later and had these investigators. But again, I just was very disappointed that they had to go the alien route. Why? And also, I have to admit, I believe in bloodhounds. I think they have utility. However, I think that they're being misused in paranormal investigations. But the ghost hunter crew seems to like to use them. And to say that they can smell decayed matter through leaves on trees makes me not want to go under a tree anymore.
It sounded like a very homeopathic, bloodhound, if that's the case.
Yeah.
But it's also, as we kept saying, there would be so many more easier ways to, especially if it's a cemetery. There'd be so many more easier
Right.
ways to demonstrate that one had been there or whatever.
Right. Now, yeah, the whole bloodhound scene. Like, granted, if someone's like, "Hey, we want to bring some bloodhounds out to go over this property," I'd say yes every time, just because I want to hang out with the dogs. So it's like, sure, yeah, bring them over. Sounds great. They can run around a bit. Everyone will have fun. But the bloodhound handlers, whenever she was saying that, and the guy was standing there in his like crisp camo pants, I was just I don't know. They did not instill confidence the way that the electrician and contractor did.
Right, because there are qualified like bloodhound handlers and whatnot, and
Given that was what was kept in for like a 7-minute segment, I worry that if they did film this over like 3-4 years, I'm worried what didn't make it in, from an editing standpoint, if that is the case, because it seems like such an obvious red herring.
Yeah, I think that they also brought the neighbor in who, there was this just overarching statement that beyond that tree line, it's different. Again, I kind of, the thing that really kept hitting me is that we bring our own weather wherever we go. And, in my line of work, where I work with people all the time and people that are, they're carrying a lot of negative energy with them, and there's reasons for that. I do believe, and then the hysterics around the tree, and it just seemed a little bit concocted, unnecessary. There was some production. I think like you said, what actually got left out. Was it that bad or not? I do think that, I am a pretty sensitive person, and to be fair to the homeowner and to her plight and to her situation in history, there is definitely something I was picking up just vicariously by watching the video and by watching in that house. That house was very dank and dark, very dark.
So
I'm like, this is a 1990s house. It looked like its decor was 1970.
right. So yeah, just real quick about that, Brad, because I want to see your opinion on this, being someone who has the psychological background that you have. So yeah, she had this house specifically. She designed and built this house. She said that at the beginning. So like, she designed it. I did not get the impression she's a professional architect. The house has a lot of metal on the outside, and it's like bright red. It looks aggressive. And so it has all this like modern style architecture on the outside with how the windows are, like they're very triangular and stuff like that. And then you get inside and it's super cluttered. There's no consistency to any of the decor. It's just kind of like cluttered. It's very dark, like you said, everywhere. It's like, how do you have all these windows, but it's still so darn dark in here? And just like they were showing the art that she had in the house. And like, as someone who has creepy art in their room right now, like I saw this art and I was like, that can't help the vibe in this place. Like, there's no way that that's helping. So like, kind of prove your point, Brian, that like you do bring this stuff with you. And I think, someone should have walked into this house and just been like, can't we get like Chip Gaines in here or something and get like this place made over and like see what happens? Because like that, like, no joke, that probably would have helped this lady.
Yeah, I think there was a very interesting thing that I kind of picked up from her towards the end of this documentary, and it was about why she would never move. I think there was an inquiry about her potentially, or she made a reference to not wanting to sell the place. And I can't really remember the exact statement she meant to say, but it was and there just really appeared to me to be an attachment here. Now, that's not unusual in and of itself. I should be talking because I do have family, and Nick knows this. I own family property outside of where I live here, and I am attached to that property, and that's not necessarily unhealthy. But what I was talking about was more of a psychic attachment,
Right.
where there was just something kind of mooky about the whole thing of why most people would say, I'm out of here. I'm selling, getting my money out of this place. It's new. The housing market, I'm going to take advantage of it, and I'm going to go someplace else.
Yeah, this lady
went to so many haunted house movies.
Right. And this lady's not selling this house in like 2020, like at the height of like the housing market boom and everything. And it's so, yeah.
Well,
it's
and
just,
in a town that its population
growing.
has more than doubled in the last 20 years.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's 4,000 people, but when I was in the area, it was a blip.
You know, we've hit on a lot of, I think, important things tonight that we've talked about quite a bit on other episodes, but this documentary did a really good job, I think, of bringing all those things kind of like together. And if folks out there want to see what we're talking about, like, please go watch the documentary. Like, I have no problem supporting these folks because, again, I do think that just like Brian said, I agree that they're genuine, and in various ways it was entertaining, and I am going to watch the other one when I get a chance. But overall, it hits on this topic of like that we keep going back to this. So there's more going on here than what people seem to want to talk about in their current narratives. And I think that when we start bringing a more holistic approach to any element in the paranormal, we're going to realize how much more there is to learn about stuff outside of the paranormal. It's all much more interweaved and not as siloed as some of the narratives make it seem.
Or as Brian beautifully said earlier, we bring our own weather with us. I really like that line. Now, thank you, Brian, for watching this and kind of putting down your thoughts and impressions. I'd be curious to see what the second part looks like. And Brendan, I'm going to kind of throw that onto you to take a look at. If there are other things you feel like we should be watching, though, and you're interested in our take on it here, Brendan, how do people get a hold of us? I haven't asked you that in a while.
That's true. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, or you can send us an email at the Ghost Furnace Podcast at gmail.com.